Welcome to our discussion on pandemic ethics. Where do we go from here? This event is sponsored by three esteemed institutions: the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, which is also our media host; the Trebuchet, a higher education consultancy founded by one of the event organizers, Sherman Teichman; and the Hastings Center. For those of you who are aware of the Hastings Center, it's been around since 1969. It's been a leader in discussions of medical and research ethics, and is a go-to forum for discussions of the latest ethical issues arising around the pandemic. My name is Wendell Wallach. I'm a Carnegie Uhuru Senior Fellow, and at the Carnegie Council, I co-direct the AI and Equality Initiative. And I'm also a senior advisor to the Hastings Center. Few crises have underscored such a breadth of ethical issues and the near-term consequences of our making good choices as this COVID-19 pandemic. We become aware of the fragility of our social systems and how their effectiveness can be undermined by politicization, of our reliance on unpaid workers who are taking great risks to serve our needs, and of questions of prioritization in the distribution of vaccines, and around richer countries hoarding vaccines. Social justice considerations, security, and end-of-life issues all enter into the mix. We have a wonderful and informed panel of speakers today. I'm going to introduce each one of them before they speak, but I also want to tell those of you who are participating, feel free to put in comments or raise questions in the chat, and we will get to that before the end of our event today. Jonathan Moreno is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Jonathan, you wrote this book with Penn President Amy Gutmann on "Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die." Sounds like a verse for a country and western tune. You wrote the book in 2019, and the paperback is just now coming out, and you and Amy decided you wanted to add a new foreword called Pandemic Ethics. So tell us a bit about the book, what the book was intended to do, and why you pivoted to add in this new afterword.
Well, thanks, Wendell, and thanks to the co-sponsors for letting us all be together in this remote fashion, my good friends and colleagues. On the side, I do wonder if funders will be bringing people together in person after this, or will be doomed to Zoom, but that is a topic for another day. So as you said, Amy Gutmann, a political philosopher and president of Penn, former chair of the Obama Bioethics Commission, on which Nita served, and Jason also had something to do with that. We published this book in 2019 in the old world. The idea of the book was to provide a framework for a popular conversation about bioethics. And we started with a couple of historical chapters. And the basic trajectory of the little field of bioethics that has become, sadly and so prominent in the last year in the public health sector, the trajectory is, how did we get started in the field in a way that did not lead us to, and what I'm going to say might be contentious, but I'll say it anyway, to give a high priority to the ethics of public health. I think it's fair to say that traditional medical ethics, this is a field that Ulf especially studies in the European setting. Traditional medical ethics was what some people have called doctor ethics or doctor-oriented ethics. And for various reasons, the emergence of new technologies, the emergence of civil rights movement, stuff that the Hastings Center, one of our co-sponsors, is very much a part of in the late 60s and today. For various reasons, the focus was on the patient, on the individual. And we see this in just the sort of standard list of bioethics principles respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, where respect for persons or personal autonomy is the first among equals, as some have said. And justice is much less well defined. By the time that our little field of bioethics got started at the Hastings Center and at the Kennedy Institute in the late 60s and early 70s, it really looked as though the era of infectious disease was behind us. As a matter of fact, there was an urban legend that I believed for a long time that an American Surgeon General actually said that in 1971, that the era of infectious disease was behind us. That was an urban legend. It's not true, but it felt true. It felt as though we were somehow over the worst of the terrible epidemics and pandemics that had plagued humanity for millennia. And it's really interesting that by 1980 you have the eradication of smallpox. The whole, to use the word narrative that we tend to use a lot these days, the whole narrative seemed to be been there, done that. And then, of course, in the early 80s, you have the emergence of HIV/AIDS, a catastrophe for so many people that I witnessed up close when I was working at an inner city medical school in Brooklyn. But still, it didn't really, the HIV/AIDS epidemic didn't really orient us back to a more public health oriented view of bioethics. It affected people who were having intimate sexual contact. It affected IV drug users. It affected people who were receiving blood or blood products. And I think while it's certainly true that there are many people who came to specialize in public health ethics because of HIV/AIDS, didn't really change the trajectory of the field. Important work was still, being done on rather high-tech issues, and I will say that I'm responsible for some of that as well. We were focusing on brain science and on genetics and so forth, to the extent that textbooks, when I started teaching before there was electricity, to the extent that there were textbooks in bioethics for these experimental bioethics courses in the 1970s, the ethics of public health, the ethics of resource allocation tended to take, at a theoretical level, the form of lifeboat ethics exercises, right? Who gets to stay in the lifeboat? And to the extent that it was policy oriented, the case in question tended to be solid organ transplants, or who gets the dialysis machine. So we really did not have very much of a public health focus in the field. And although you didn't ask, Wendell, I will say that, how did I react to this in February and March? By the way, the last time that Wendell and Nita and I were together, the last actual in-person conference I attended in ethics and science was one that Nita organized at Duke. And I felt at the time, this is early February, if memory serves, that I think a number of us felt something ominous was lurking, but we didn't know the shape of the beast. I guess I spent the first month or two in this room in my house, kind of breathless. The first few weeks, I said, this is the stuff that I should have been thinking about and writing about, for years, decades, in fact. And I missed the boat. I missed the lifeboat. I didn't get it. And now I think when Amy and I wrote the book, we were getting ready for the paperback, and we, both of us said at the same moment, talking on Zoom, we really need to write a postscript now on pandemic ethics. And we were writing that, of course, was still very much in the beginning of this event. So what we try to do in the postscript is identify some of the themes that had already emerged. Since then, of course, there are more. I think we did pretty well in getting the big themes as they were last summer and early fall. And I think we've captured some of them, and we'll be talking about them today, perhaps. The failure of our public health system to adequately address a situation like this, particularly in the US, and the lack of leadership. I did spend a month or two last year when this was unfolding as my own kind of academic form of self-therapy, reading histories of epidemics and pandemics that I should have read, that my colleagues have read, that I hadn't read. And one of these historians said, you know, if you've seen one pandemic, you've seen one pandemic. There are so many different variables at play. So I think we're still sorting this out. But I do think, and I'm going to stop with this, there is a kind of reckoning that needs to take place in our field in bioethics. We need to rethink our orientation, and that's going to be a little painful. That's especially going to be a challenge for younger folks who will have to live with the theoretical frameworks that we developed coming out of this. And I do think we are in an important conceptual turning point in thinking about the field of bioethics and traditional medical ethics.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think I'm gonna come back with a question after we've had each of our introductions. Nita Farahany is the Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at Duke Law School. And I think it's fair to say that Nita is really a leading figure internationally in the ethics and law of emerging technologies. I know that one of the topics that has concerned you, Nita, has been the public trust in science, and perhaps you can talk a bit about that in the context of the pandemic.
Thanks, Wendell, and thanks to both my fellow panelists and also to the sponsors of this conversation, which is both timely and important. I do want to talk about public trust in science, and it builds really from what Jonathan was talking about of the fact that, you know, bioethics, especially within the United States, has been very individually autonomy focused. And the conversations that we've had, the rhetoric that we've had, the way in which we have fashioned bioethics has traditionally focused very much on the individual. And when we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic, which isn't about individuals, but is about the community and the global community as a whole, and requires concerted effort on the part of a global community as a whole to be able to address, it's particularly problematic to not have any of the structures in place or any of the rhetoric in place or any of the ethics in place that enable that kind of coordinated global response. And part of what I want to focus my remarks on to just start the conversation as fodder, I hope, for continued conversation, is the fact that one key element of this, one key element of both the fact that this rhetoric hasn't existed, that the ethics and the ethical analysis has been missing in a lot of the field, is the role of the public institutions in being able to bring people together and to establish trust to enable that kind of coordinated effort. And here in this global pandemic, particularly within the United States, public trust in science has been deeply undermined at a time where it's essential that it be high and that our trust in public institutions be high. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them, and a really important one, is the politicization of science. That is, rather than having science be this kind of objective set of information which is based on facts and grounded in facts, it's been a tool that has been used by political parties to be able to advance their objectives. And Jonathan, I think, will be able to speak well to this idea. He wrote a really terrific book called The Body Politic, which looks at the interesting alignments that exist on science, which are not your traditional alignments around, you know, Republican and Democrat as we understand it in the US. And in fact, there are some odd bedfellows who find themselves together when you talk about issues that are divisive within science. And one of those issues that has been incredibly divisive ties into this question of bioethics, this individual versus community ethics. The idea of, should we be acting just to advance our individual interests, or do we need to be acting to advance the interest of society as a whole? So one has been politicization of science. The second, importantly, has been misinformation, intentional spreading of misinformation, which, you know, at a time when misinformation is an issue across every dimension. Misinformation in science and misinformation in the middle of a global pandemic means that people don't know whether to trust the information that is being given to them by public officials, by anyone, what they read in the news, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it's true. And when we're all isolated from one another, where you rely so heavily on what you read and what you hear within the news, having misinformation and intentional misinformation becomes even more deeply problematic. It becomes even more of an issue with respect to developing public trust in science. The third big issue has been the lack of transparency. So the way in which you both fight misinformation, but also develop trust in science, and this has been true throughout science, regardless of whether or not it's public science or scientific publications, has been ensuring that data and information are widely available and are transparent. And when information instead is kept hidden, when information is intentionally clouded and in misinformation or news sources, and there are repeated references to things like fake news, and you're not giving people accurate and true information, it becomes even harder to be able to develop the kinds of public trust that you need in order to be able to advance the community ethic that we need to be able to emerge from this kind of a pandemic. And then there have been a number of missteps as well. Some of these unintentional, some of these quite intentional, but that feed into each of these previous ones. For example, when there was a claim on Twitter that was made that masks don't protect individuals, stop buying masks, they don't help, it becomes then so deeply problematic just a little while later to say, no, masks work and everybody should wear them. The right answer at the time should have been to say, look, masks work, but there's a shortage of them, right? We have a massive shortage, and here's the problem with individuals acquiring those masks versus having those available to healthcare workers. If they don't have them, when you go to the hospital, there will be nobody there to treat you. Our frontline workers are essential. And so that kind of misinformation and intentional misinformation made it incredibly problematic for us to be able to get this pandemic under control. The result means that they're in the beginning and still today became a poor uptake of mask wearing in public in the United States. And that's in part because of this idea of like, well, if I'm personally not at risk, why should I have my liberty infringed upon without an understanding of the community ethic that's needed, but also the implication of an interdependence of individuals to stop the spread of the virus. It also meant that there was an undermining of trust in the data. It allowed for conspiracy theories to grow. It allowed for this kind of belief that perhaps things aren't as bad as people say they are, or the other kinds of conspiracies that grew during the pandemic and continue to exist during the pandemic. And most critically right now, with an undermining of public trust, it means that there is still mistrust in vaccines. And right now we have this moment of hope and this moment of essential need, which is we not only have a hope for people to be able to get vaccines, but a need for people to become vaccinated, because in order for us to get out ahead as much as we can of the mutations that are happening with the virus, we need as many people to be vaccinated as possible. There's some encouraging information that I'll just say as a backdrop with this. Pew Research issued a study in September of 2020 looking at public trust in science. And they found that there are, of course, some public divides over science and that there's some partisanship, but that there still is a high degree, relatively, of trust in scientists, even if there has been an undermining in the trust of public institutions. The trust in practitioners like medical doctors is stronger than that for researchers in this field, but that skepticism about scientific integrity is really widespread. And this, which is the thing that most boosts trust in scientific research findings, is making data openly available. And so right now we have this opportunity to really turn things around, right? We have a new administration in the United States that's in office. We have a new moment with widespread, hopefully, distribution of vaccines. And that moment is the moment at which we should be making as much scientific information publicly available as possible. And that's why I think the moves by companies like Pfizer and Moderna that made their protocols widely available and transparent was a very good move. Those are the kinds of moves we need right now to make as much transparent data available as possible to be able to move toward a place of restoring public trust and restoring public leadership in science to be able to help us navigate through this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Nita. Ulf Schmidt is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he's a professor at the University of Hamburg. Ulf, I'm sure you have a lot to say about differences between what's happened in the United States as far as public trust of science and what is happening in Europe. But I'd also like to emphasize your work as a historian specializing in the history of medicine and medical ethics, and particularly want to ask you, how important is historical contextualization in understanding aspects of the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Wendell, and thank you for the Carnegie Council for hosting this event. I might sort of preface some of my comments that historians are generally rather cautious in talking about the present and even more about the future. So, but I do think that in this particular case, I might add the odd additional dimension to this conversation. What I think is interesting in just following and listening to both Jonathan and Nita is what is interesting is that most of the issues which have been raised by both speakers and also within the public domain, that most of these issues are not new, and that past societies and past governments and states have been grappled with them and tried to find solutions. And if anything, it does potentially indicate that humanity doesn't seem to be particularly good in learning some of the lessons, or at least from past mistakes. And as far as my own work is concerned, I think what is interesting here, and I think Nita already addressed this, even in my own work, there has been a considerable focus on the individual in the past. I looked at the history of Nazi medical experiments. I looked at the development of Nuremberg, particularly the Nuremberg Code, in which key ethical principles for human experimentations were formulated after the Second World War, and which kind of, started the beginning of some of the debates in terms of human rights and human experimentations, and ultimately also were particularly important in developing the bioethics field as a whole. What is interesting when we contextualize these developments is that they happen at the backdrop to these developments is a new response in the post-war world, particularly in Europe, to the catastrophe and the destruction of the Second World War and the horrors which go along with it. So we're having a context in which there is a serious moment of reflection going on, how it could have been possible that science was involved in some of these ethical violations, whilst at the same time, there is a genuine attempt to rebuild Europe and the world into a better future. And that also involved, and I think this could be important for our discussion, major changes in public health and public health systems. And also in terms of international organizations collaborating to ensure that certain diseases would be eradicated. We're thinking of malaria, at least that was an attempt in the 1950s. We're thinking of polio later, and all sorts of international linkages which were established in that period in order to ensure that the degree of nationalism and the degree of antagonism between countries, which brought the world to its knees in the 1930s and 1940s, would never happen again. So that's just as a preamble. And in my own work, I've been interested also in terms of looking beyond the kind of what we would call the Western narrative of bioethics by looking at other places, for example, in Eastern Europe, to what extent medical ethics and medical and health played a particular role. And I think what is interesting already coming out of that work is that we see a general sense that in the post-war period, health is of enormous importance for societies. at various levels. It also becomes indeed a propaganda tool that societies wanted to show the extent to which their infant mortality rate was declining faster than in other countries, for example. So public health was not understood in any form or shape or form in a kind of negative form, as it is sometimes being seen as a bigger state or even attached to kind of socialist or ideological ideas. It was seen very much imbued with a kind of positive narrative in order to improve the health of the people as part of what one could consider a general understanding for the common good. Now, if I sketch this in very broad stroke, what one could say that certainly over the last 2 to 3 decades, certainly from about 89 onwards, and that has to do with politics, that has to do with a form of neoliberalism, the whole idea of, and I think that was already touched upon, the role of public institutions, and that means also the role of the state, the role of welfare, all these bigger ideas, including international organizations. And I think the fact that the United States dropped out of the World Health Organization during the Trump presidency is only the pinnacle of that, the end of that development, signified a kind of battering of these broader ideas to keep the world together. To put it crudely, public health was not sexy. It was far more interesting to invest in researches like individual personalized health, to look at individual rights, to look at all sorts of aspects which were more interesting rather than the field of public health. And I think we are, to some extent, paying now the price for having not invested and put enough resources into that. And I just want to conclude with one aspect of this debate. When we are looking at these very broad strokes here, and we're looking at institutions and societies, I think we also need to look at the whole level of experiences. We are looking at often at quite abstract levels and forget that there are different generations involved here, including the generation of children for whom the pandemic is now over 1 year old. And I think in the whole debate, I would wish like that we also consider some of those dimensions as well.
Thank you very much, Ulf. Jason Schwartz is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Yale School of Public Health. Jason, you previously trained in the history of medicine and public health, and I wondered if there's lessons that you've learned from past mass vaccination programs that have informed how this one has been designed and carried out so far.
Sure. Thanks, Wendell. Thanks to our organizers and co-sponsors, and great to be here with our colleagues on the panel. Yes, I think as Jonathan noted, no two epidemics are the same and no two pandemics are the same. And this pandemic has absolutely caused us to write a new playbook in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of how we gather evidence, how we marshal evidence, and how we put that evidence to work in terms of thinking about policy responses. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of the vaccination program, which is an area that I've spent a lot of my work in the past, and certainly in the last 6 or 9 months or so, thinking about the ways in which evidence gets gathered and marshaled and deployed and translated into regulations and policies in public health, particularly around vaccines. And clearly what we're living through every day is a lifetime's worth of work to start thinking about those interfaces and to contribute to some of them as I've done. I'll say a little bit about as we go along. One of the things I've also been interested in the topic of our conversation this afternoon is the ways in which ethical considerations, ethical determinations, value judgments are often latent in the development of policies and regulations and the consideration of scientific evidence. I've always been fascinated, maybe even a little frustrated, I could say, in the ways in which sometimes there's lots of ethical work happening in terms of how we think about medical technologies, how we think about health policy decisions, how we think about the regulation and promotion of vaccines in particular. But often that ethics work is not brought to the surface. It's not made explicit. It's sometimes papered over as quote unquote objective scientific evaluations, and the issues that are flagged or coded as ethical sometimes get sent off to another group, another committee, another commission, another panel to say, oh, this is an ethical issue, bring in the ethicists. So I've always been interested in the ways in which ethics is absolutely unresolvably entangled in a good way, in an important way, with the ways in which scientific officials, health officials, experts of all stripes think about the work that they're doing. So I want to say a little bit about how that can help us think about what we're seeing with respect to these vaccines that we're seeing news every day in the newspapers in the United States and around the world about the ways in which I think can disavow this idea that the ethical work of science and medical policy making and regulation are somehow able to be disaggregated from one another. And I'll pick up on a few points that our previous speakers, really all of them, I think, have amplified, and just bring them to this particular site around vaccine efforts here in the United States, from the work that happened over the summer and fall and the work that's continuing with respect to the evaluation, the data collection and evaluation of the clinical trial results for these vaccine candidates. First, the two that are available in the United States, and we have a process that's ongoing right now, even as we speak, for a third vaccine and a few more in the pipeline. And throughout the summer and fall, there were questions and discussions about process, for one, to Nita's point about transparency in terms of how the data would be collected, how the data would be shared, how the data would be deliberated upon publicly by the expert advisors of the Food and Drug Administration. And I think a really important asset to the review of these vaccines was the fact that there's been a considerable amount of data, not all the data to be sure, but a considerable amount of data that was made public for the scientific community, for the medical community to think about with respect to those vaccines, in keeping with this importance of transparency and public confidence in the vaccines, which we know is always a challenge for vaccination, but a particular challenge at the moment we've been living through, and concerns about the role that interference could play in the prior administration's decision to deploy these vaccines. So there was one, certainly the transparency piece showed up in that evaluation area, but it also, I think, shaped a lot of those questions that the FDA, thinking historically for a moment, has faced throughout its history. This balancing act that it encounters with any intervention that it's reviewing or considering, this balancing act where it's often criticized at one extreme for, in some cases, having too many requirements, too many demands, too many expectations, too complicated a process that could needlessly delay the interventions that can save lives or prevent disease from becoming widely available. That's been one set of critiques of the FDA throughout its history. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's obviously concerns when there are issues that emerge with a medical product after it's introduced and made public. If something goes wrong, if we find a new safety issue, then clearly there are often alarms that the FDA has failed to live up to its consumer protection obligations. So, and everywhere in between. So the FDA has always faced this balancing act between speed and rigor, not that those are in conflict with one another, but along that spectrum of how it does what it does. And it's encountered that with respect to these COVID-19 vaccines in terms of the requirements, the expectations it has set for manufacturers to give the kind of data that would give the medical and public health communities confidence in these vaccines, but not creating procedural hurdles or hoops to jump through or additional requirements that would encumber the sort of swift introduction of these vaccines once a critical amount of evidence is made available, is evaluated and disseminated. So we see that even just in the past day or two. Looking at the news, we've got this very favorable initial report about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we may be seeing here in the United States as early as this time next month. And there are already some eyebrows being raised that the key advisory committee that will review these vaccines and will look at the safety, look at and make sure we have confidence to deploy this vaccine on the scale of tens of millions of doses. This vaccine advisory committee is not going to meet until the end of the month. And there have been some sort of cynical observations from public commentators and editorialists that say, boy, there's a global pandemic going on here, maybe they could, move things a little bit more quickly, which those of us who study vaccine policy would say this is warp speed, pardon the unfortunate phrase, in terms of how the FDA would actually review a submission in a matter of weeks and duplicate the data analyses, generate the reports, generate the discussions. But it's a balancing act. And clearly, God forbid, if there were to be a safety issue that emerged after these vaccines have been introduced, and thankfully, the story we've seen so far is an incredibly favorable one, the repercussions, the second guessing about the pace of the FDA's review would clearly be under the microscope. So that's one point in which the scientific advisors, the policymakers, are absolutely balancing this role of consumer protection, of minimizing risk, but also recognizing the great benefits that come from accelerating these vaccines as quickly as possible, and trying to find that sweet spot in their work. When we think about the vaccine rollout, the deployment of these vaccines, the ethical issues are even more apparent. And I think, again, have shown the ways in which they are inseparably connected from the questions of public health and deployment and the optimization of our public health strategies. And we've seen that, I think, in two interconnected ways that I want to spend these last few minutes of these opening comments reflecting on. The most obvious has been the incredibly difficult, challenging discussions around our allocation frameworks, these prioritization groups that we've had a bevy of learned panels and bodies offering guidance in terms of how we can think about allocating our limited vaccine supplies during these initial months where our supply is clearly inadequate to meet the need and demand for these vaccines. And we've had groups from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that issued some guidance, some framework for thinking about the ethics of these allocation issues as early as last summer. But then we also then had the work from the Centers for Disease Control, immunization advisors, the Immunization Advisory Committee that makes the vaccination schedules, the science-based schedules that have guided vaccination in the United States since the 1960s. They've offered their own prioritization frameworks. That's where this phase 1A and phase 1B and phase 1C, the sort of Lake Wobegon effect where everyone is in phase 1, we're just continuing to slice that in ever thinner increments. And then we have states that ultimately are the arbiters of thinking about how they should deploy the limited vaccine supply they're receiving. So here in Connecticut, where I live and work, our governor has a vaccine advisory committee on which I serve, along with a number of other health professionals and community leaders and elected officials that are then also thinking about how to allocate these scarce vaccine doses and what are we trying to optimize? Are we trying to save the most lives, prevent the most hospitalizations, recognize the increased risks that certain individuals encounter because of their occupation, because of their health status, because of their age, or some combination? The answer is clearly all of the above, but that's a difficult set of principles to weight and then translate into, okay, which subgroup should get these vaccines now and which subgroups should wait when there are large percentages of the population that have, I think, an important public health and ethical claim to receiving some priority in these vaccine rollout. So these are all activities where, of course, ethical analysis, ethical insights, ethical arguments are clearly helpful in helping us think through these issues. But by no means have they been carved out and saying we're going to create a group of an ethics committee to sort these out. But I think they've been recognized that they are unmistakably inseparable from the scientific and clinical and public health issues that relate to the success of this vaccination program. The last point I want to come to the equity concerns, which are part and parcel with allocation and prioritization, but they also raise more cross-cutting issues in terms of how we think about our healthcare system. And we know that COVID has not affected all communities equally. We know that communities, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, have been particularly severely affected by COVID hospitalizations and deaths. We know the structural disparities in our healthcare system that help explain some of those inequities. And I think we know from the White House on down that we can't allow those inequities to be reflected in the ways in which these vaccines are distributed. And we're seeing already, frankly, troubling signs in cities around the country that show that the disparities we see elsewhere in healthcare are manifest in who's getting vaccines in these early weeks of the vaccination program. So here's a case where I think there is clear understanding that there is an important problem that can't be allowed to happen. There's a lot of strategies and to try and address it. There's no single magic bullet for sure to addressing equity in our vaccine access programs, but there's a clear recognition from everyone, not just from the ethicists, to the scientists, to the elected officials, to the public health officials, that ensuring that our vaccines make our additional effort, the additional programs, the additional initiatives to make sure that these vaccines reach our historically underserved communities that have lots of barriers, transportation, language, access to health interventions, that we make those additional efforts to give everything possible to reach those communities is both a public health imperative and a moral imperative. And that's what groups like our state committee is working on. The White House has an Office of Health Equity to try to translate those ideals into action. And I think that will be one of the many arbiters of the success of this vaccination program in the months to come. So with that, I'll throw it back to you. And I'm grateful to be part of this wonderful group this afternoon.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank all four of you for the breadth of issues you've already raised for us. Jason, you mentioned the Johnson & Johnson trials, which were just announced last week, and I think they've gone today for expedited approval. I also want to bring to the attention of those listening in that within a day of that announcement, Jonathan Moreno and two of his colleagues already had an analysis of the research findings up on the Hastings Center Bioethics Forum. So again, that's a go-to source for those of you who want really quick responses on and quick analysis of some of the latest ethical issues that have arisen. Before I ask each of you a question, I also want to remind those of you who are attending this discussion that we do have a chat box open for you to put in your questions or comments. That is being monitored by one of my colleagues, and I'm going to turn it over to him in another 20 minutes or so. But first, Jonathan, I hate to be expanding this canvas even more broadly, but in much of your previous work, you've had a lot to say about national security. Can you make some links between your concerns around national security and pandemic ethics?
So one of the items I've been thinking about for the last few weeks is the way that we in the US at least, and maybe this can help to tee off an exchange with Ulf, consider that what falls in the category of a quote unquote natural disaster. This is really for the lawyer, for me, but natural disasters in our system at least are physical in nature. Hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, earthquakes. Interestingly, that biological disasters are not considered in our regulatory scheme, in our government scheme, to be natural disasters. And yet I think it's very clear that this is one. And it's very clear that it does have national security implications. In the early weeks of the pandemic, the US military made a number of adjustments that are not well publicized, but one that was identified in March was a decision by the US Army not to let people cycle out on schedule, and not to move them around to new deployments, because you don't want to move the bodies around if you can avoid it. And so, and messages were sent, I think we can be assured, to our adversaries, the US adversaries, that we were still focused on the work of defending the nation. So there's no question but that we need, I think, to take another look at the way in which we integrate worries about public health into our national security system. Now, there's a very powerful objection to that from many political scientists, which is, oh, great, let's just extend the reach of the state now. This is called securitization into everything. And let's use a pandemic as an excuse to do that. This is, by the way, part of I would say, the more thoughtful objections to some of the prescriptions of public health officials in this country, at least, and worries about moving into a surveillance state. But I want to say one other thing that I think everybody also has alluded to, and is going to give me a little excuse to get into this, and maybe again a kind of transatlantic conversation as well. The fact that the leading government public health official, Dr. Fauci, has played such a bizarre, iconic role in this situation. This is somebody I've known somewhat for decades. I think there's a deeper analysis to be done, and if you'll forgive me, public health and politics can't be disentangled. They're both about bodies and how bodies interact, right? So in the U.S. system and our political system, our two political parties, like all parties, are coalitions, and in the Republican Party, the coalition between business-oriented, commerce-oriented internationalists and social conservatives had held together quite well, partly because of the fact that Ronald Reagan somehow seemed to satisfy both veins in the party. This, I think, began to change with the end of the Cold War, when there wasn't a common enemy to unite those veins of the party, an anti-communist orientation. And you see people like Pat Buchanan and Ann Coulter beginning to appeal to the populist vein. Now, Nita alluded to the anti-science sentiment or the skepticism of science, and she says, I've written about this. If you think about it, the conservative movement, the far-right conservative movement in this country, right populism, there's also left populism, right, in terms of anti-vaccination, but right populism, which is particularly on our minds right now, is a reaction to elites. And so you think about, let's face it, academics tend to be on the left. The entertainment industry tends to be on the left in terms of cultural orientation. Technology tends to be on the left, or maybe those people are libertarians, hard to tell. And science is seen as an elite institution. Much of it takes place at our elite institutions, the universities in the US and in Europe. So I think that part of the breakdown that we've seen in the last year has been kind of tearing off the Band-Aid of something that has been festering for a while. An emerging populism of the right that is skeptical about elite institutions, that feels left out, that doesn't trust the values that are being transmitted by professors like us to the sons and daughters of America's parents. That, I think, has manifested itself a little differently in Europe than it has here. But I think it's essential to understand that this is a several decade old shift, and it's in the nature of the political coalitions that we call our parties.
Thank you ever so much, Jonathan. All of us on this panel are scholars in one form or another, and as scholars, we're all aware of the great amount of energy that goes into writing an article, and therefore we're pretty careful which articles we select to write. Nita, particularly given your breadth of expertise and interest, I'm fascinated by the fact that you chose to write one particular article in relationship to the pandemic called "Proof of Vaccination Will Be Very Valuable and Easy to Abuse." Can you share with us what the intention of that article was and why you chose to focus on it?
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Fine.
So one thing that was pretty clear to me as soon as the vaccination campaign started, and as soon as companies and others started to jump on the bandwagon of creating things like digital passports. And of course, even earlier in the pandemic, as people talked about the concept of immunity passports, as people recovered from getting COVID, was the potential for abuse of this system. as Jason discussed in some of the distribution politics and the challenges that we have faced, not just with respect to things like respirators, but also with the distribution of the vaccines, the plan that we have come up with respect to distribution of the vaccines is based on where we are in the pandemic, right? If we were at a very different point in the pandemic, we might not have chosen to vaccinate the most vulnerable, for example, first. It might have been to stop the spread of the virus. It would make sense to, first vaccinate people who are younger and more likely to spread the vaccine, right? So it reflects the moment that we're in. It doesn't reflect necessarily anything other than that. And as a result, it also doesn't reflect the ways in which the pandemic have affected people socioeconomically, right? So the people who have borne the greatest risk and the greatest impact socioeconomically are not necessarily the ones who are going to have access to the vaccine anytime soon. And in fact, we're seeing quite the opposite. We're seeing lots of people gaming the system, even people who have access to resources or to technology or know how to make appointments quickly or have connections are figuring out ways to get the vaccine sooner. So I wrote that article with a recognition that as people started to see the vaccine rollout and started to have things like, I'll just flash this quickly. This is my vaccine card, which shows that I've been vaccinated because I was part of the Moderna study as part of the clinical research study. And as an unblinded participant now, I know that I received the vaccine. That vaccine card should not be my entry ticket back into society. At least not right now, right? We do make vaccination an important consideration for things like attending schools and other issues once it's widely available and it has full regulatory approval. But I was concerned that first, it would raise significant equity issues to condition people's reentry into society based on whether or not they had a vaccine card or existing immunity. And that jobs and availability of resources, the ability to go to a restaurant, the ability to be able to attend a venue or an outing or a concert, if it relied upon your access to a vaccine card and there's maldistribution already of the vaccines, that would further create this divide that the pandemic has only exacerbated. The second is that I worried that there would be a significant risk that people, again, would misunderstand, right? One thing that we still do not know the answer to, and there is some evidence in both sides on this, is what does it mean to be vaccinated for other people, right? If I'm vaccinated, my risk of severe disease has gone down drastically. But does it mean that I'm not going to spread it to other people? Will I remain asymptomatically potentially infected and able to infect other individuals? And if we reopen society based on this lack of understanding, that it would exacerbate these problems I was talking about earlier, undermining public trust, but also returning us back to this place that is really based on individualized ethic rather than community ethic. My behavior hasn't changed much because the rest of my family isn't vaccinated. My children aren't vaccinated. My husband was also in the Moderna study. He wasn't vaccinated. He was given the placebo. And so my behavior is based on the risk to the other people that I can come into contact with, or my parents who weren't vaccinated until recently. And then the third was, creating this black market, right? Which is once you start making it contingent for people to gain reentry into society based on things like a vaccine card, you create a significant risk of forgeries, of people who are, bartering these types of cards. I think that creates a black market, and that's problematic. And then I'll just say as a side note, given that I'm so concerned about public trust and transparency, it's important to remember that while there's very good data on these vaccines, it's still limited in time. And that's the reason why they have emergency use authorization and not full regulatory approval yet. And requiring people or conditioning participation in society on taking a vaccine that does not have full regulatory approval yet, I think further undermines public trust in science and creates a greater degree of mistrust, particularly among the communities where that mistrust has been so deep and so problematic, like minority populations throughout the United States. And so I personally wrote that article because I thought this is a moment at which people are going to make some serious missteps
ethically about conditioning participation in society based on vaccination status. I'm all for people getting vaccinated if they want to get vaccinated, and I hope that vaccines will be as widely available and accessible to everybody who wants them and for everybody who needs them. But I certainly don't want to make people's ability to participate in society right now, when that's not the case, conditioned on whether or not they have a vaccine card.
Great, wonderful. Ulf, you've already been primed by Jonathan for some input on the security perspective from Europe, but I also know that you're interested in investigating the origins of the pandemic. And I wondered if you could talk about the importance of that and where you see the role of ethics in this.
Well, I do think historians like to go back to the beginning. And I do think at some point, maybe not now, but once the dust settles a little bit, and once we sort of recovered mentally and physically from this, I do believe that it will be necessary to look very closely how we got into this position. And I think there are, how did the world got into this position? And I think it will be necessary to look at many levels. We need to look at our regulatory levels, our governments and governance levels, how science operates. And I think there will be, I think the scientific community and indeed the public needs to be part of that conversation, which will have to happen. This is not just for experts, but I do believe that there will have to be a serious or a period of very serious reflection. And I'll just give you a couple of examples where and just to illustrate that, I wrote sort of a chapter which I call The Limits of Altruism, in which I looked at the history of medical ethics over the last sort of 50, 60 years. And I also looked at some of the commissions operating in the United States since the 1990s. And most of you will be very familiar with these commissions, including the Presidential Commission on Bioethical Studies, which looked at experiments which had been conducted in Guatemala after the Second World War. And as part of this conversation at the time, there was a full review of how research is actually being conducted in the United States, how it is being funded in public institutions, and what do these public institutions actually know about the work they are funding. And what was interesting, and I thought, was when they wrote the report, and Jonathan can speak probably much more authoritatively than I can, the report was called Ethics Impossible, if I remember correctly. They made 18 recommendations to public institutions and organizations what needed to be addressed. That organizations, for example, needed to have an idea where the research is being conducted, on how many experiments were being conducted, that they had some grasp about it, which they hadn't at the time. What was interesting is that the people who pushed this, who wrote this report and who submitted it, they also included a feedback loop. They wanted to know whether these recommendations had actually been implemented. And it probably won't surprise you to find out that of these 18 recommendations, 2, which were the most benign, the softest one and really not particularly important, only 2 were implemented. All the other 16 were ignored. So I think that what I'm basically trying to say is that we will have to look at how our systems, how our structures in public institutions actually operate, and whether we are actually willing to take a really quite a hard look at this. And coming back to your question about the origins, we will have to have a look at how science is operating. At the moment, there is a big debate in the science community, what's called gain of function research, which some people will be quite familiar with. We will have to look at the scientific communities who were working with viruses over the last 10 to 15 years in laboratories, high risks research. We will have to look at that and actually study it very carefully. I'm not saying there is a sort of conspiracy here that this virus escaped from China, from a Chinese laboratory. But I do feel that research has to ask difficult questions, and that we have to allow for these questions without being pushed into a kind of conspiracy corner, and that there have to be calls for greater transparency, including China, to come up and allow this kind of work to look at this. I think it's just not good enough to just simply say, oh, this is just some escaped from a cave, and now we're all dealing with the consequences. I do feel that we as a world community should actually have the courage to investigate this without fear or favor, and have a look at this in an as objective and as even-handed way as possible once the dust has settled. And this should not be about nationalism. This should not be about a blame game. This should be clearly about trying to understand on the best available evidence, which we then have at our disposal, to get a reasonably good idea what could have happened, because only then will we be able to learn some of the lessons so that this will not happen in the future.
There's a lot of lessons to learn. Jason, you don't claim to be a prophet in any way, shape, or form, but I wonder if you can look at your crystal ball for a moment, and if there's ethical issues related to the vaccine rollout that you see looming on the horizons, which haven't received widespread public attention yet.
Sure, I'll note one or two. Not that they aren't issues that aren't already starting to bubble up a bit, but I think we'll hear much more about them as our vaccination program expands and continues. I think right now, understandably, the interest is on capacity, vaccine supply, pace, speed, of course, while also collecting additional data about safety and effectiveness. But I think we're in this stage right now where we're still thinking about those issues in the vaccination program. Other issues that are already simmering and will gain, I think, more attention as spring turns to summer and summer turns to fall. One is touched upon on that piece that Jonathan and Angela Shen, our collaborator, and I wrote for the Hastings Center Bioethics Forum, that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine signals, but doesn't quite get at, I think, what we might be encountering with respect to sort of those interconnected ethics and policies issues as we see additional vaccines, that really do look different from one another with respect to their performance. We don't need to get into sort of the granular detail about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that yes, it looks a little different in terms of its overall efficacy, but it does seem to be really protective against the hospitalizations and deaths. So the degree to which this vaccine might be treated differently than the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, I think remains to be seen. But what we're hearing from the Dr. Fauci's of the world and elsewhere is that I think it's seen as another nearly as good tool in our vaccine toolkit. And that may be very well how it's deployed. But it could certainly be the case as we learn more about our existing vaccines and we gather new data about their performance in different populations. We learn more about their ability to prevent transmission, not just disease, and we gain additional vaccines, that we might see some very stark differences that can't be generalized when we look across vaccines, that might raise, very difficult questions about how we strategically deploy particular vaccines for particular populations to maximize particular benefits in terms of reducing deaths or mortality or transmission, or if there's a vaccine that does have a rare adverse event. I think there are going to be these let's call them higher order deployment questions that we're going to encounter just as we learn much more about our existing vaccines as well as those that are being developed. And we think about where we're using those vaccines, as Nita said, in the context of what the pandemic looks like at the time. So that's something I'm really interested in thinking about and watching and understanding how the data and the policy and the ethics converge as these cascading complexities unfold likely over the coming months. That's one issue. The second one that's already certainly getting some attention, that Nita touched on it as well, is we have to keep very clear focus on the issue of vaccine hesitancy that isn't getting a lot of attention right now, because right now there's this incredible desire that we're seeing from individuals to get vaccines as soon as they can, and we're not able to meet that pent up demand, and we won't be for some time. But even in our long-term care facilities, where vaccine hesitancy among staff has always been a concern, particularly around flu vaccines. We're seeing it with respect to the rollout of COVID vaccines here in Connecticut and around the country. Individuals who have doubts and questions about these vaccines, overlaid with the perennial skepticism, hesitancy, lack of confidence that some members of the public have for vaccines in general. So I think we need to realize that as this vaccination program goes on, it will not simply be handing out vaccines as quickly as individuals line up to get them, but we're going to have to think in very sophisticated ways about the roots of vaccine hesitancy, the kinds of responses that are necessary to resolve concerns or questions around the vaccines, how those need to be tailored to particular communities, the particular questions and issues they raise. And from that sort of ethics policy matter, we're going to certainly start hearing increasing discussion around measures to ensure high vaccination rates. And the one that gets the most attention, generates the most controversy are the role of vaccination requirements, vaccination mandates. You already hear questions sometimes at press conferences to our federal health officials, to our state health officials about, will this vaccine be mandated and when, and for what groups? For healthcare workers, for students, for teachers. The questions, I think, will continue to gain attention. It's premature right now. We need to have our supply in order. We need to exhaust our ability to get those vaccines to those who are eagerly pursuing it. But there likely will be a time to reach the vaccination rates that we're aiming for, to do a lot of work with hesitancy. And then you'll hear much more discussion about the role that school entry requirements or other types of vaccine mandates might play in this long-term pursuit of vaccination goals. So I'm interested in that. I think we'll hear much more about both of these in the months ahead.
Wonderful. Before we turn to the questions and comments in the chat, I want to push all of you to thinking a little bit beyond Europe and America and our approaches to vaccine distribution. Here at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, we've been particularly concerned about the ways in which emerging technologies exacerbate structural inequalities and even create new forms of inequities. And therefore we created this artificial intelligence and equality initiative. Now we have this miracle of vaccine creation. And I think all of us do see it as a miracle, not only in the speed at which traditional forms of vaccines are appearing, but here with Moderna and BioNTech and Pfizer, we have actually a totally new approach to the development of vaccines. And actually that turned out to be the quickest approach. But we also have a rather difficult situation internationally. According to an international consortium of NGOs, people in the 70th poorest countries have roughly a 9 or 10% chance of getting a vaccine in 2021, whereby America and Europe are looking to having all their citizens vaccinated in those years. There are these questions about whether people should be jumping the line or not, but I noticed in a conversation with Peter Singer, where he actually felt that, at least from his utilitarian analysis, it might even be acceptable to allow the rich to bid to have early vaccines if the money that they contributed went to ensuring that the poorest among us were vaccinated. But even in that context, Gavi, which is collecting funding to vaccinate the rest of the world, it has roughly a 37 billion budget, and it's only been able to raise a fraction of that. Even in the midst of an analysis that suggests that there will be a growth of $1 trillion in worldwide productivity, most of it going to the richest nations if we can get everybody vaccinated. So I just wondered whether any of you want to comment on that, or perhaps a little discussion about the challenge of distributing vaccines for the rest of the world.
I'll jump in for a moment just to say, this, of course, is not a new problem. It is a problem that we see with particularly acutely right now. But if we were to look at the same issue, which is the distribution of life-saving medications this is the problem we have worldwide, which is there is, a significant difference. Now, one thing that I will just note that is different here is a recognition that with an infectious disease, it's actually problematic, and even in the interest of the countries that are likely to vaccinate all of their own, to actually figure out a solution to this problem, right? With other kinds of medications and life-saving medications, countries have not been well enough incentivized to think about this as a global problem. But in this instance, when you see variants that are evading vaccines or substantially reducing the efficacy of the vaccines, and we recognize that the biggest reason why the virus is mutating as quickly as it is because it's a virus left unchecked worldwide, there should be a recognition and a need for collective action that every country should recognize the self-interest even in doing so. So my hope is that that will actually motivate a difference in response than the kind of response that we see generally with the maldistribution of medications, of technology, of all of the global inequities that we see in healthcare and in health and in the distribution of care. In this instance, at least, this is perhaps jaded of me to look at it this way, but at least there is a good incentive for collective action that will lead to a different response, I believe, in this instance than in every other instance where we have those problems.
Does anyone else want to weigh in?
Well, I'm happy to make a couple of observations. I think, particularly on this vaccine debate, and there obviously is a lot about it, and as you rightly said, it is a very impressive development on the one hand, but I do think we also have to contextualize things a little bit and relativize them. This is not all about vaccine as a silver bullet. That is not the solution. I think what is most interesting here, and I think again we can, when we look at history and history of pandemics, what these kind of health crises, as we could call them, what they often do is they exacerbate and throw into relief existing social, economic, and political tensions. They highlight injustices more than anything, and they can, in some cases. Examples are the cholera epidemic in places in Europe in the 19th century and other examples. They can lead to positive change and improvements. So just to focus now on vaccines and vaccine distribution, vaccine effectiveness, in a sense would narrow our perspective to potentially too far. We need to make sure, I think, to keep the bigger picture in perspective. What actually has this pandemic shown us about our way of living, how we live as a world community or family of nations, how we treat each other? I think those kind of the questions, they are fundamental questions about us individually and collectively, how nation states operate between each other. And Nita was saying that. I cannot emphasize it too strongly. International collaboration, international organizations, they have been enormously weakened over the last two decades. Now, if you look at the funding of something like the World Health Organization, which is, it's partly funded by the Gates Foundation, it's partly where people are on soft money, and partly by nation states. But if you would look at the actual amount, it's probably less than a day's work of Mr. Bezos. It is pitiful. And so it raises questions about we as a world community are basically set up for events like that. Those are the bigger question. And Nita was saying that we need to look at it in the perspective of access to medicine, access to healthcare. And I think those are the bigger questions. We need to look at broader questions of inequality, opportunities in education, all those are the bigger questions in which all this is actually part of the story. And I think that we should not forget about it. And the final point is there are countries in the developing world which actually have responded quite well, and that to the pandemic without enormous resources. Why? Because A, they had experiences of the epidemics and they learn lessons from it. Because much of what we're talking about are issues about basic hygiene, basic issues of public health, and these kind of issues, they have learned the lessons to implement quickly and actually it's not only about resources and vaccination distribution. It's a much bigger issue here, which we are addressing when we're actually moving away from just our Western perspective.
Let me turn to my colleague, Alex Woodson, who's been monitoring the chat. And Alex, perhaps you can underscore a few of the points there and see if there's some responses from our panelists.
Sure. We have 3 questions that I'm going to read right now. I think they're mostly things that we've covered, but maybe bring up some new points to finish the discussion. So from David Sang, does the need for vaccination undermine the idea of consent in any sense? From Rachel Svetvanov, apologies if I mispronounced that. What also is going to be a concern is the fraudulence or counterfeiting of vaccines and or vaccine cards. Has that already been considered in other discussions? And from Richard Wilson, is the WHO up to the task of coordinating vaccine requirements for the third world? What are responsibilities for the most developed nations who have the capacity to develop the vaccines?
Jonathan, you want to come in on that first piece on informed?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just tell you a story that the late D.A. Henderson told, who was one of the leaders of the WHO smallpox vaccination campaign. The story goes essentially that a team is in the subcontinent in the 1970s. They're going from house to house. They walk into a home that is presided over by a woman, and there are children, and they say, we need everybody now to hold out their arms and get this jab. And the woman says, where's the food? Oh, well, the food's coming. The food's coming. It'll be here in a few minutes. Well, there was no food. I think we need to accept that their public health at this scale is not necessarily pretty. And the eradication of smallpox, like the fact that we still don't have polio eradicated in some parts of the world. I was in Karachi 15 years ago or 16 years ago and talked to some people from WHO who were going out to some of the tribal areas in Pakistan. I think we have to come to grips with this. This is part of what I think we started talking about in this session. Consent issues don't fit neatly into a public health crisis.
Nita, Ulf, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I can jump in a little moment, and I think it was addressed already. It depends where you're looking at. If you know, having first of all, historically, for example, East Germany had a vaccine. Vaccination was compulsory. Yeah, so you had to be vaccinated, and young adults, you would receive up to 20 vaccinations up to when you're 18. And even today, as some of our previous speakers said, you know, if you want to go to school, you have to have a certain vaccination in certain places. So actually having the requirement to be vaccinated in certain historical periods and times is not completely unusual in the first instance. But there is obviously a bigger issue here. If you are making vaccination a requirement for taking part in society, meaning if you are, want to go and go to the cinema, or if you want to travel on the train, then you're entering into a difficult territory. And I think that's where we will have that debate. I think we need to be quite specific about the places and the circumstances in which we might require people to be vaccinated. Otherwise, I think it is important that people can continue to have the choice to take part in society without having to vaccinate if they do not feel they want to go down that route. I think we need to be very careful here and getting the balance right.
Jason or Nita?
I'll just say I agree with that, which is, we have seen in the US in particular, the response to government mandates and government lockdowns. And it hasn't been pretty. And it hasn't been pretty for a number of reasons, including the lack of public trust, but also just that is not the historical approach that this country has taken. One of the questions that I saw in the chat here is this question about, how does the state response and our knowledge of the pandemic redefine citizenship in America? It has fundamentally, I think, reshaped the way people see their relationship to the state and the way that they see their relationship to each other, probably a renewed understanding of what the federal government can and cannot do and what states can and cannot do, and how the variation among states may, track much more closely to politics than they do to science. The result, I think, is that we do have to tread carefully, to Ulf's point, when we get to the point where we can take a breath from this pandemic, where we can step back and have the luxury of reflection, right? Right now, we're still very much in crisis mode, but when we can have the luxury of reflection, that is one of the questions that we, fundamentally have to ask is, what is the relationship between, individual and state? What is the role of government, and what is the role of states versus national coordinated efforts? What are the powers of national governments to be able to enact uniform, potentially liberty stripping measures that are, essential to public health in the common good rather than for the individual good? And so, I think we will have that luxury, I hope. And when we have that luxury, these are all the fundamental questions that we will need to be asking about what's the right balance between individual liberty and autonomy and community ethics and community response in the name of the common good.
Wendell, I'll jump in. I don't have anything to add beyond what I said previously on the consent question, but in that series of questions we heard, there was one about the global vaccination issue, which I didn't comment on previously. And the question was, is WHO up to the task of coordinating vaccines for developing countries? And I think that's a hard question to answer. And the answer is probably not on their own. And as with so many other issues where there have been critiques of the World Health Organization, yes, to some degree, that's an indictment of the WHO itself, but it's really an indictment of the global community, the member states who support, who fund, who bankroll, who give the WHO not just its budget, but its mission and its mandate and its resources. We see the failings in epidemics and pandemics and other health issues around the world, where a strong, robust World Health Organization, I think, could be a tremendous asset to efforts and certainly to this vaccination program. Now, what's emerged in that, I don't want to say a void, but to supplement what the WHO can't do on its own, are absolutely the global health organizations heavily supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are likewise collaborating with this vaccination effort. So that you can't tell the story of global health without the story of the Gates Foundation. And that raises really interesting, profound issues about this question about democratic governance for global health versus a landscape that has, the fingerprints of a foundation that is shaping so much of our global health agenda and committing, I should say, obviously, the resources to support that vision. So we've got, with this global vaccination effort, the consortium, the World Health Organization, Gavi, the global public-private partnership that does tremendous work with childhood vaccines typically. And we have another Gates-supported organization like Gavi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. I think that's the spelling of the acronym CEPI, that jointly are supporting this COVAX facility that, Wendell, you noted, that's trying to be the global coordinating body to procure and deliver vaccine doses, particularly for low and middle income countries. But as you've noted, the fundraising has come in from fundraising, meaning the donations from member states, particularly high income countries, has come below the targets that are clearly needed to vaccinate large numbers of the population. in these low and middle income countries. The estimates for the numbers of individuals that could be reached just from a supply perspective, not just the distribution issues, are staggering. And I think, what the estimates tell us is that we're talking well into 2022 or beyond for the vast majority of residents in low and middle income countries having access to these vaccines. And of course, think about how that would be acceptable if we heard that from elected leaders in the United States or Western Europe. So there's a lot of work to be done. Clearly, I think this is a case, as the questioner asked, where there's such strong arguments, whether it's for global solidarity, whether it's self-interest, as Nita noted, for leadership and contributions from higher income countries. We're starting to see that. I think, the fact that we'll see that here in the United States with the Biden administration back in the World Health Organization, joining this COVAX facility, which the prior administration had decided to sit out. Those are steps in the right direction, but I think that's something, and one of those other issues we absolutely need to keep our eyes on, because the challenges, the barriers to making this vaccine rollout look anything close to equitable globally are just immense. And we know enough from past experiences to know, all that how short we could fall as this work moves along.
So our time, unfortunately, is just about run out, but we did start a few minutes late. I just wonder whether any of the panelists have a last summarizing comment that they would like to make.
Well, I like the fact that Ulf ended by mentioning the kids. I know that all three of my fellow panelists have small children at home. Mine are big and out. That's good and bad. But we do need to keep in mind the intergenerational problem, the social, psychological, emotional effect that this is having. All my colleagues on the panel and other friends I have, I see how hard it is. I said to my class last fall, a Zoom class, at the end of my last remark, when we were focusing on the pandemic and other global bioethical issues, is I'm sorry on behalf of my generation. We screwed up. We made, Wendell, it was your fault as well. We didn't do well. And I think we need to, as all the panelists have said, we need to come to terms with some fundamental mistakes we made and look at them honestly. And since, I will go into my dotage imminently, I can afford to do that and take the blows as they come. But we do need to grapple with the fact that we have, in so many ways, in this particular topic, failed the kids.
Both Nita, Jason. Well, then just let me thank you all in conclusion. This has been really a remarkable and broad-reaching discussion. I think the fact that if we haven't failed the next generation, we will have failed them if we don't act on some of the precipitous issues that have been underscored by this pandemic will be revealed over the next few years or so. But many of us have been talking about how this is an inflection period in history, whether that's due to climate change or exacerbating inequalities or the onset of emerging technologies that are radically destabilizing the world as we've known it. We still have this charge of whether we can bequeath the next generation with a world worth living in. And if there is a good side to this pandemic, it has given us a little bit of a time out to reflect on what we have created, and perhaps more importantly, underscored some of the truly egregious issues that we have not attended to. So again, thank you all ever so much.